I just wanted to take the kids on a hike, but instead we encountered something paranormal. The plan was simple: a weekend hike in the Shenandoah National Park with my kids, Lily and Ben. They had been begging for an outdoor adventure, and I figured it was time they experienced the serenity of nature away from the distractions of the modern world. Shenandoah was a favorite spot from my own childhood. Rolling hills, whispering trees, and trails that seemed to weave into the heart of the earth. It was peaceful, or so I thought. We set out early on Saturday morning. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and pine needles. The sky was painted in shades of pale blue and gold as the sun crept over the horizon. Lily, 8 years old, skipped ahead, her laughter echoing through the woods, while Ben, at 10, carried our small backpack with a sense of responsibility that made me smile. The trail we chose wasn't particularly challenging, but it was secluded. That was the appeal. No crowded paths, just us and the forest. By noon, we reached a clearing near a ridge that offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. The scene was postcard perfect. Emerald treetops swaying in the breeze, shadows dancing over the landscape as clouds drifted lazily overhead. We set up our tent, had sandwiches for lunch, and spent the afternoon exploring nearby trails. As evening approached, the forest began to transform. The golden light faded, replaced by the cool, silvery hues of twilight. A faint mist began to rise from the ground, curling around the tree trunks like ghostly fingers. The kids were tired but happy, and we settled by a small fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The woods seemed alive with the sounds of the night: crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and an occasional owl hooting in the distance. But as darkness deepened, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, a hush that fell over the forest, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Then came the sound, a low, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on wood. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was a woodpecker or a branch swaying in the wind. The tapping grew louder. "Just the wind," I muttered under my breath, more to reassure myself than the kids. But I could see the unease in Ben's eyes as he glanced toward the shadowy woods. Lily seemed oblivious, already drifting off in her sleeping bag. I doused the fire and climbed into the tent, pulling the kids close. The fabric of the tent felt like a flimsy barrier against the vast, dark wilderness outside. I lay awake, straining to hear beyond the pounding of my heart. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as though it was drawing closer. Then it stopped. The silence was worse, the kind of silence that feels alive, pressing in on you from all sides. I held my breath, listening. That's when I heard the crunch of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly close. I sat up, careful not to wake the kids, and grabbed the flashlight. Unzipping the tent as quietly as possible, I stepped outside. The air was colder now, and the mist had thickened, swirling around my feet. I swept the flashlight beam over the trees, the light cutting through the fog. Nothing. Just the skeletal silhouettes of trees and the dense underbrush. Then I saw it, a figure, barely visible through the haze. It stood motionless between the trees, its outline tall and thin, like a shadow that had stepped out of place. My throat tightened. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. I stumbled back into the tent, zipping it up hastily. My mind raced with possibilities. A lost hiker, a prankster, or something worse. I clutched the flashlight like a weapon, my hands shaking. Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, waiting for dawn, every sound amplified in the oppressive darkness. When morning finally came, I stepped outside cautiously. The figure was gone, and the forest seemed ordinary again, bathed in the soft light of day. I convinced myself it had been my imagination, or a trick of the shadows. But then Ben found it. About 20 yards from our campsite, etched into the bark of a tree, was a strange symbol. A circle with jagged lines radiating outward like a crude sunburst. It wasn't something nature had created. And it wasn't alone. Similar symbols were carved into several trees surrounding our site, forming a rough perimeter. "We're leaving," I said, my voice firm. The kids didn't argue. We packed up quickly, the cheerful chatter of yesterday replaced by an uneasy silence. The trail back seemed longer, the forest heavier, as if it was watching us leave. As we neared the parking lot, I glanced back one last time. That's when I saw it again, the figure, standing at the edge of the trees. It raised an arm, as if waving goodbye. But there was something wrong, something off about the way it moved. Its arm bent at an unnatural angle, like a puppet on strings. We drove away in silence. The image of that twisted wave burned into my mind. I haven't been back to Shenandoah since, and sometimes, late at night, I think I hear it again. That rhythmic tapping, echoing in the distance, as if it's waiting for me to return. My friends and I wanted to have fun on a hike, but we must have ended up in some cursed forest. Camping in the Adirondack Mountains sounded like the perfect escape from the chaos of daily life. Sarah, Jenna, Alex, and I had planned this trip for weeks. The rugged beauty of the forest promised adventure and a much-needed break. The dense canopy above shielded us from the blazing sun as we hiked to a secluded spot deep in the woods. By the time we arrived, the air was crisp and cool, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. It felt like we had stepped into another world. We set up camp in a clearing bordered by towering trees. Their branches stretched like skeletal arms, almost blotting out the sky. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the forest in hues of orange and purple, a calm settled over us. We roasted marshmallows over a crackling fire and shared stories, laughter echoing into the night. It was perfect, until it wasn't. The first sign of trouble came as we were settling into our tents. A faint rustling sound broke through the stillness. At first, I brushed it off as an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But as the night deepened, the sounds grew more persistent. Footsteps, not the light tread of an animal, but deliberate human-like movements circling our camp. My heart began to race. Each crunch of leaves amplified in the oppressive quiet. Morning brought little relief. As we inspected the area, we found strange carvings etched into the bark of the surrounding trees. The symbols were intricate and eerie, spirals and jagged lines that seemed to twist unnaturally in the dim light. "Maybe it's some kind of old trail marker," Alex suggested, though his voice betrayed his unease. Still, we shrugged it off and decided to stick to our plan of exploring the nearby trails. The forest felt different that day. The sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to shift when you weren't looking. As we hiked, we noticed more carvings on the trees. They weren't just around our camp. They were everywhere. Worse, our trail markers seemed to have been tampered with. The bright ribbons we had tied to guide us back to camp were either missing or replaced with ones in different colors. It was unsettling, but we convinced ourselves it was just some prank by other campers. By the time we returned to our clearing, the unease had blossomed into full-blown dread. Our campsite was in shambles. The fire pit had been scattered, tents slashed, and supplies strewn across the ground. The carvings on the trees seemed more numerous, almost encircling the camp. None of us spoke. The air was thick with an unspoken fear, a shared understanding that we were not alone. That night, the nightmare began in earnest. The footsteps returned, louder and closer. Then came the voices. At first it sounded like distant chatter, indistinct and muffled. But as the hours dragged on, the voices became clearer, familiar. They were ours. I heard my own voice calling out from the forest, mocking and distorted, laced with an unnatural edge. "Mike, come here," it whispered, the tone dripping with malice. Sarah swore she heard Jenna's laughter echoing through the trees, though Jenna was sitting frozen beside her, pale and wide-eyed. Panic set in. We tried to leave, but every trail led us back to the clearing. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring to trap us. The carvings seemed to pulse in the darkness, their twisted shapes glowing faintly. Time lost meaning. Hours felt like days as we stumbled through the endless maze of trees, only to find ourselves back in that cursed clearing, the voices growing louder and more aggressive. By dawn, we were frantic. Exhausted and terrified, we made one final push to escape. This time, we managed to find the road leading back to our car. Relief flooded over me as the sight of the vehicle came into view. But that relief was short-lived. The car keys were gone. We searched every pocket, every bag, but they had vanished. Then we saw it, a fresh carving on the hood of the car, the same eerie symbol that adorned the trees, etched deeply into the metal. None of us spoke as we stood there, staring at the mark. It felt like a warning, a final taunt from whatever had been toying with us. With no other choice, we began the long, silent walk back to civilization. Even as we left the forest behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Weeks have passed since that night, but the memories linger like a shadow. I can still hear the mocking voices in my dreams, feel the oppressive weight of those twisted carvings. Was it a person, an animal, something else entirely? I don't know. All I know is that I'll never set foot in those woods again. Camping on Silverwood Lake, which I will never be able to forget. Let me tell you about some strange events that happened years ago at Silverwood Lake. For a bit of background, my family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, the whole crew, has this tradition of camping every year. We usually spend about 4 days out there. The first day is all about setting up camp. The next 2 are for camping fun, and the last day is for packing up. Since we live near the mountains, we like to switch up our camping spots. One of those places was Silverwood Lake. We'd been there a few times before, and it was always nice. Quiet and peaceful, with not much wildlife or dense forest. It was the kind of place where you could actually relax. During our trips, one of our favorite things to do was go hiking. The trails were just the right mix, not so many that you'd get lost, but enough to keep it interesting. Hiking became part of our routine. One trip, though, we headed out later than usual. Just to be safe, we packed flashlights and headlamps in case it got dark. We were walking on a familiar trail when we noticed something new, a path we'd never seen before. It was unusually wide enough for all 12 of us to walk side by side without bumping shoulders. Thick trees lined the sides, which was strange since the forest in that area was usually pretty sparse. Curiosity got the better of us, so we decided to explore the new trail. We walked for about 40 minutes, and by the time night fell, I was on the edge of the group near the tree line. We didn't want to turn back just yet, so we turned on our flashlights and headlamps. Not even 5 minutes later, every single light went out. It was pitch black. We froze, confused, and started asking each other, what just happened? That's when I heard it, rustling in the dense forest to my right. The sound sent a chill down my spine, but before I could say anything, all our lights flickered back on. My grandma, who's pretty superstitious, decided that was enough for one night. We all agreed and started heading back the way we came, half jogging until we felt safe enough to slow down. Back at the campsite, we lit a fire, cooked dinner, and tried to relax. Nobody really talked about what had just happened. It was like we silently agreed to pretend it hadn't. Eventually, everyone turned in for the night, except me. I couldn't sleep. The rustling I'd heard earlier stuck with me, especially since there wasn't much wildlife in the area. And even if there were, nothing out there was big enough to make a noise like that. Lying in my tent, I kept my eyes wide open, listening to every little sound, the crickets, the occasional coyote howls. Then, suddenly, it all stopped. The night went completely silent. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. That's when I heard footsteps. My first thought was that someone had gotten up to use the bathroom, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The steps were too slow, too deliberate. They circled our campsite, over and over, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek through the small gap in the mesh window of my tent. What I saw froze me in place. It was a tall, shadowy figure, hunched over with bent knees. It stood still for a moment, then turned its head like it knew I was watching. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. After what felt like forever, it started walking away. But even as it left, I couldn't shake the feeling it was still watching me. The night sounds slowly came back, but I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, things seemed normal again. Everyone was laughing, talking, and cooking breakfast. It was almost enough to make me forget about the night before. Later, we decided to pick up where we left off and go back to that trail. When we got there, though, the path was gone. Completely. In its place were fully grown trees, as if the trail had never existed. We all stood there, stunned. After a while, we just went back to camp. Nobody wanted to talk about it. The next day, we packed up and left. None of us brought it up again. Years later, we returned to Silverwood Lake for another trip. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing. Off on a neighboring mountain, we spotted a small white house. Curious, one of my cousins grabbed a pair of binoculars. The house was old and run down with an eerie vibe that made us all uneasy. We decided to leave it alone. The next year we went back again. This time the house was gone. We looked at the same spot, but all we saw were trees. It was like it had vanished. It's been about 3 years since my family last went camping. We're planning another trip soon, and Silverwood Lake is on the list. Honestly, I'm a little nervous. I hope whatever happened back then stays in the past. I still cannot forgive myself for not being able to stop them then. I've lived near the forest my whole life, and while it's beautiful, it's also a place that whispers of dread to anyone willing to listen. The locals call it the Hungerwood, because over the years, so many have gone in and never come out. Their stories are passed around in hushed tones, children vanishing while playing hide and seek, experienced hikers who never made it back to their cars, and even rescue teams that seem to evaporate into thin air. I'd heard them all, but none prepared me for what happened that night. It was early autumn, the air crisp with the promise of winter, and the forest seemed alive in its decay. Leaves crunched underfoot, and the trees, stripped bare, looked like skeletal fingers reaching into the sky. I was stacking firewood when I spotted 3 teenagers at the edge of the woods. They looked like the usual type. City kids trying to chase some adventure out in the sticks. Their backpacks were oversized, their clothes too clean, and their faces carried that air of invincibility that only comes with youth. I called out to them, waving to catch their attention. They hesitated, and for a moment I thought they'd just keep walking. But curiosity got the better of them, and they came closer. "You planning to go in there?" I asked, gesturing toward the dense thicket of trees. They exchanged glances, and one of them, a lanky boy with a mop of blonde hair, nodded. "Just for the night. We've got supplies." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I'd seen this before. "Don't," I said firmly. "This forest, it's not like others. People disappear. It's not worth the risk." They laughed nervously, and a girl with dark hair tucked under a beanie said, "Thanks for the warning, but we'll be fine. We're sticking to the trail." I didn't argue. You can't convince people who don't want to believe. They turned around, and for a moment, I thought I'd gotten through to them. But as the sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in fiery hues, I saw them again. They were further down the trail, just entering the woods. That night the wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling my windows and carrying with it strange sounds. Not quite voices, but not entirely natural either. I stayed up late, staring into the dark expanse of trees, the unease gnawing at me. Then around midnight I heard it. Screams. They weren't the playful kind or even the startled kind. These were raw, primal, and filled with a terror that clawed at your soul. I wanted to ignore it, to convince myself it was just the wind. But the sound lingered, echoing in the stillness of the night. By morning, the forest was quiet again, but the silence was heavy, like it was holding its breath. I couldn't ignore the gnawing guilt. If something had happened to those kids, it was partly on me. I should have tried harder to stop them. So, I grabbed my jacket, laced up my boots, and headed into the woods. The morning light filtered through the trees, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. But even in daylight, the place felt wrong. The air was colder, heavier, and carried a faint metallic tang. I followed the main trail, scanning for any signs of them. At first there was nothing, just the usual wilderness. But then I saw it, a crumpled candy wrapper lying in the dirt, something that didn't belong. Further along, I found a water bottle, half empty, sitting upright on a mossy log. It felt deliberate, like breadcrumbs leading me deeper. About an hour in, the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, their trunks twisted in unnatural ways, and the ground turned soft, sucking at my boots like it wanted to pull me under. The light dimmed, though the sun was still high in the sky. That's when I found their campsite, or rather, what was left of it. There were no tents, no backpacks, no teenagers, just a clearing littered with oddities. A single hiking boot, a torn piece of fabric, and a smartphone lying face down in the dirt. I picked it up, pressing the power button, but the screen stayed black. Around the clearing, the trees bore strange marks, deep gashes that looked like they had been clawed into the bark by something massive. The worst part, though, was the silence. No birds, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, watching me. I called out, my voice shaky but loud enough to echo, "Hey, are you out there?" Nothing, not even the sound of my own echo returning. I decided to head back, but the forest had other plans. The trail I'd come in on was gone. In its place was a dense wall of trees that hadn't been there before. Panic set in, cold and sharp. I tried retracing my steps, but the more I walked, the less familiar everything became. It was like the forest was shifting, rearranging itself to keep me there. As the sun sank low, plunging the woods into shadows, I started hearing things. Footsteps that didn't match my own. Whispered voices just out of reach. And then, the screams returned. They were faint at first, like they were coming from miles away. But they grew louder, closer, until they sounded like they were all around me. I ran. I don't know for how long or in which direction. I just ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Finally, I broke through the tree line, stumbling out into the open field near my house. I turned back to look at the forest, half expecting to see something emerge. But there was nothing, just the endless trees standing silent and still. I never saw those teenagers again. No one did. Their families put up flyers, search parties combed the area, and reporters came sniffing around for a story. But nothing ever turned up. The forest kept its secrets, as it always does. Now, when I see people heading toward the Hungerwood, I don't bother warning them. They wouldn't listen anyway, and maybe the forest likes it that way. Apparently, someone just didn't like my tent. I've always loved the serenity of the mountains, the way the crisp air fills your lungs, the solitude that makes you feel like you're the only person on Earth. So when I decided to spend a weekend hiking the Appalachian Mountains, I was looking forward to escaping the grind of daily life. My plan was simple: hike all day, find a secluded spot to camp, and let the quiet embrace of nature reset my soul. The day started perfectly. The late summer sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow on the vibrant green foliage around me. The air was just cool enough to make the uphill trek enjoyable, and the sound of birdsong accompanied me as I made my way along the rugged trails. By evening, I found the perfect spot, a small clearing nestled between towering pine trees. The ground was flat and soft with moss, and the view overlooked a distant valley that seemed to stretch on forever. After setting up my tent and gathering firewood, I lit a small fire and settled in for the night. The golden hues of sunset faded into a deep indigo sky, and the stars emerged, twinkling brightly against the vast darkness. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, the aroma of sizzling food mingling with the earthy scent of the forest. Everything felt perfect, as though the world had aligned to give me this peaceful moment. The crackling fire and the rhythmic chirping of crickets lulled me into a sense of safety. Once the fire burned down to embers, I doused it, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself into my sleeping bag. The gentle rustling of leaves outside was a comforting lullaby, and I quickly drifted into a light sleep. Hours passed in dreamless quiet, but then, sometime deep into the night, a sharp feeling jolted me awake. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like an instinctive awareness that something was off. My eyes opened to darkness, but my ears strained to catch any noise. At first, there was nothing but the steady hum of the forest. Then I heard it, a faint, deliberate rustling just outside the tent. My stomach knotted as the sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't the random scurry of a small animal. This was heavier, more deliberate, like something or someone was moving with intent. Before I could act, the fabric of my tent jerked violently and I froze. Something was clawing or tearing at the nylon walls. My heart thundered in my chest as I reached for the zipper, desperate to get out and see what was happening. But the zipper wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I yanked, it felt stuck, as if some invisible force was holding it in place. Panic surged through me. My breaths came in short, shallow gasps, and my mind raced with possibilities. A bear, a mountain lion, or something worse. I pushed against the walls of the tent, trying to create enough force to shove my way out, but whatever was outside seemed to match my movements, pressing in as if taunting me. I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed. It was a raw, primal sound, born of pure terror. I thrashed and kicked at the fabric, hoping to scare off whatever was out there. The rustling stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence that was almost worse than the noise. For a long moment, I stayed frozen, every muscle in my body taut with fear. Then slowly, I heard retreating footsteps, slow, deliberate, and fading into the distance. I waited, hardly daring to breathe, until the forest sounds gradually returned. The crickets chirped once more, and the wind whispered through the trees. Finally, With trembling hands, I managed to wrench the zipper open. I stumbled out into the cool night air, clutching my flashlight and shining it in every direction. The campsite was undisturbed, save for the shredded fabric of my tent. There were no footprints, no signs of an animal, no evidence of what had been there. The silence felt oppressive, as though the forest itself was hiding a secret. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the extinguished fire, too scared to sleep. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, every shadow and flicker of movement sending my heart racing. When the first rays of dawn finally broke through the trees, I wasted no time packing up what remained of my gear. My hands shook as I worked, and my eyes darted nervously toward the tree line, half expecting to see something watching me. By the time I made it back to the safety of my car, the events of the night felt like a surreal nightmare. But the jagged tears in my tent were a stark reminder that it had been all too real. To this day, I have no idea what or who was out there in the woods with me. But I do know one thing. The mountains are not as empty as they seem. And sometimes it's better not to know what's lurking just beyond the firelight. If you liked these stories, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell to listen to new stories from Mr. Fear every day. Thank you for watching.